I love when the oneness exudes. If you were here for John Boyle's meditation, you'll see how oneness moves, and your very moving song, Beautiful, is perfect for today's lesson. I'm taking a deep breath. Today's lesson title is Practicing Compassion, Transforming Suffering. And little did I know when I wrote that lesson title so long ago that my father-in-law, I did not know that my father-in-law would have made his transition 2 weeks ago. So practicing compassion is indeed, again, a demonstration of perfect oneness. And when you're prayed up, miracles just happen. So there are many routes to truth, right? One of the metaphors I like to use is that if you picture a bicycle wheel, you know, you have a center hub, and then you have spokes that go out that attach to the rim and ultimately to the tire where the rubber hits the road, right? And so I consider that center of the hub to be the center of truth. And there are many pathways, many spokes into that center. And I'll be using that analogy to talk about the different spokes into this center of truth. So first, imagine, if you will, your child has learned how to walk and then begins to learn how to run, but gets going a little too fast for the rest of the body and gets out of balance. What happens? They fall. And then what happens? They cry. And then what do? Many different things happen here. First of all, you embrace their suffering, do you not? And yes, you cuddle them and you offer them sympathy and tenderness, warmth and kindness while the child is in pain. Is this one example of practicing compassion? So practicing compassion brings you connection to the child. Let me ask you, does that compassion transform their suffering? Did you ever kiss a boo-boo? Right? When you're dealing with children? Is there something magical when, even though they're hurting and they feel your love and your kindness and your warmth, does that move them and transform that suffering? Yes. And how does it feel for you when someone practices compassion when you are suffering? It also helps change and move that pain, does it not? And that's why we're here for each other. That's why we are a spiritual community practicing compassion and transforming suffering. Now, with that child's fall in mind, you, of course, as an adult, understand the consequences of misusing the law of gravity, right? When the child falls, do you then ignore the child and begin blaming, law of gravity, how could you do that to my child? How dare you do something like that? Do you argue with the law of gravity? Why? Why not? Because it just is. The law of gravity, whether we understand it or not, the law of gravity is the law of gravity. It does not change. Just as God does not ordain or cause suffering, there are spiritual laws. And our suffering is because we are not aligned with those spiritual laws. It is not God's will. It is us not aligning our hearts, our minds, and our essence of being with knowing the spiritual truth and using those spiritual laws in our lives. The law does not change. You can run in balance or you can run out of balance. And of course, we learn how to do that by making mistakes and by suffering. We learn from our suffering. And in science of mind philosophy and in many other philosophies, you hear this is the law of cause and effect. So, suffering is the consequences of the wrong use of the law. And because we all have free will to choose, we can keep choosing to run out of balance. We can choose how to run. And again, we will suffer when we don't understand how to learn how to balance ourselves when we run. All right, is that another spoke to the center of truth? Another scenario. If you will silently, in your mind, find a person that you are critical of, judgmental about, or that you want to control their behavior to have them act differently. Is that hard? Think about that for a minute and bring that person to mind. Now, what does science of mind say? Science of mind, I think since there are no newcomers here, we know that that's our philosophy here. What does science of mind say about the law when we're being critical and judgmental? What does the law say?
You can't control anyone else's behavior.
Correct. Can't control anyone else's behavior. Is there a saying in our society that says what goes around comes around?
Mental equivalent.
Mental equivalent. In other words, here we are using the law of the mental equivalent that what you put out comes back to you. Ouch. Do we need some compassion? You are suffering because you don't see, feel, or understand your oneness with this person. You don't offer the same sympathy, tenderness, warmth, love, kindness that you would offer the child who does not know about how to run in balance using the law of gravity. Instead, we're frequently critical, controlling, and judgmental, which is not just causing our own suffering, but causing the suffering of the other also. So that means when you're interacting, if you choose to interact, you may be rude, short, disrespect the other's view, act as if you know better. What happened to that sympathy and that love and that kindness? Suffering cannot be transformed until there is compassion. And that compassion needs to first start with yourself. Oh, I see that I have judged. And that means being compassionate with yourself. Not shoulda, woulda, coulda on yourself. Not maybe as a stern parent would be all over you. But rather just being with yourself in the understanding and knowing and offering yourself love, kindness, acceptance. Cradle yourself in that acknowledgement. And as I like to think of it like, you know, if I was stirring a pot of milk chocolate, maybe because I come from Switzerland, I've been to a lot of milk chocolate factories. I'm thinking about, you know, you take this hard bar of chocolate and you put it into that soft chocolate pot. and you soften and you warm. And you bring your heart back into melting that judgment and that criticalness. And without that judgment and with that compassion returns connection and oneness. And then maybe you discover there are ways you can approach, or different ways to approach the person that you've been judgmental of. Which means once you've practiced compassion with yourself and become aware of that, now you can offer that compassion to the individual. What do you think happens to your view of that person? Shift happens. Yes, our Science of Mind motto, long before it became a popular term today on the internet, change your mind, change the, when you practice compassion. So as John mentioned in his meditation, our book of the month is No Mud, No Lotus by Thich Nhat Hanh, who many of you know as the Vietnamese monk. And Thich Nhat Hanh discusses how we have a habit of running from our suffering. Any of you do that? You know, this tends to bring more tension and more suffering as we continue to pile on for ourselves. If we don't choose to prioritize taking time for ourselves to become mindful, just as we did in today's meditation, then we continue to pile on more of the triggers and agitations. And then we won't, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, and I love it, and John mentioned it also, we won't really ever come home to ourselves. We're just going to skirt along the top of the lake and never really get down to the true beingness of who we are to transform our suffering. Instead, we stay aloof from really knowing ourselves, from really knowing our spiritual magnificence, to really grasping being the love that we are and surrounding ourselves with compassion and letting that ooze into all of our relationships with one another. So one of compassion's main element is really about listening. And you might say, listening to what? Listening to our heart and our mind. And our heart and our mind may not be giving us the same message. And our mind, yes, chatters and chatters. But our heart doesn't have words, but we still connect with it to know whether what's in our heart is connecting with what's in our mind, right? That's sort of an innate intelligence that we sort of take for granted. Are the words that I'm saying that maybe were supplanted in my mind by teachers or parents or other people aligning with my experience and what I know and believe? Not being in alignment with these spiritual laws, with our heart and with our mind, is suffering. And our suffering is trying to tell us something. But we don't take the time to listen. We're like the child still running too fast and falling down. Why am I falling down again? And it's difficult to express compassion for others if we don't practice compassion with ourselves. Our words and our actions will be demonstrated, and it speaks louder than our words based on whether we're practicing compassion with ourselves. So, are you willing to open the unwrapped gift of what suffering brings to us? Are you willing to transform that? Are you willing to take the time to listen? Okay, I have another example. Let's say you wake up one day with a body ache. That doesn't happen to any of you, does it? I hear the giggle. And so, you know, a body's aching and it continues to ache and you just keep ignoring it, and pretty soon you're not walking the same way you used to, and then what starts to happen? Now you've got a new ache on the other side trying to balance out what you were trying to get around and ignore. So it is with your suffering. Seriously, each opportunity to connect with one another, and that's why we're here in this spiritual community, to hold each other, to express to practice our spiritual nature. And Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us how important it is to do the spiritual practice of mindfulness in all that you do. And as he says in No Mud, No Lotus, you know, our mind travels everywhere, every day. Travels to the past, travels to the future, fear, worry, imagination. Now, you know, in Science of Mind, we say thoughts are things. That's a pretty heavy suitcase. Every day as we travel through life. If we could see all those thoughts and watch ourselves stuff them into that suitcase. But are we really listening? Our body, on the other hand, opposite of the mind, can only be here in the present moment. The body can't be here yesterday. The body can't be here in the future. The body is only here and now, which is why we bring our mind home to our body, to be in the present moment. Breathing in, breathing out in our productive society might feel like a waste of time. But this is where, how much do you value who you are and your beingness? To connect with yourself, to ensure that you're not running faster than you can maintain going forward. We typically give our mind the top priority. When do we choose to give our heart that top priority? So we're humans and we suffer. We're being called to listen deeply to find the roots of our pain, that is, where we are not lined up with the truth of our beingness. Where am I not aligning with the truth? Okay, I have two more spokes in the wheel. One of them is, I speak frequently of Katie Byron, or Byron Katie, I always mix up her name. She's got a book that says, A Mind at Home with Itself. And the mind is like an unruly child. Thoughts come one after another to pester and demand our attention like an unloved child. Our job is to discern, to know the difference between an internal argument and the state where we're open to listening and receiving. Suffering appears when we try to control reality, when we think that we are the source rather than the mere image. But the thought that asserts itself and wants to be believed comes from the I know mind that is the supposed teacher. The questioning comes from the student. In the questioning mind, we experience how, if you're a true student, we experience flow. If you are a true student, the thought will always end with a question mark. Does that soften the conversation you may have with yourself? To end in a question instead of the assumptions of the I know how to do it mind. So I've spoken a little bit about mindfulness, practicing compassion. The spoke I want to go to now is called science. I'm reading the book called Buddha's Brain, the practical neuroscience of happiness, love, and wisdom. Now this is copyright, I want to say 2018. I think this is a fairly new book. Oh, it's not, it's 2009, okay. Now, this one is 2007. Train your mind, change your brain. Dr. Ernest Holmes passed away in 1960. And what is being spoken about commonly today is his belief that faith and science would come together, that science would begin to prove what faith has already known. It's here, it's now, it's common knowledge. Before the 1990s, the scientists believed that once the child's brain became an adult, our brain didn't change much. Now, I wonder why scientists thought that. How much do we change as an adult versus as a child? Now, in the 1990s, science started revealing that adults, we do develop new brain cells, and that the brain is capable of extraordinary change way into adulthood. Neuroscience is revealing more and more each day how the brain works. And the science is finding that as we become more stressed, the growth of new cells are suppressed, and we have less adaptability. This is what I think means getting old. Less adaptability. I know the way. I know what I like. I know how it should be done. So as we become, and then what they're finding, and I'm going to use some quotes, is that as we become more mindful, our brain does change. They can see it in MRIs. Scientific American article entitled, "What Does Mindfulness Meditation Do to Your Brain?" MRI scans show that after an 8-week course of mindfulness practice, emphasis on practice, the brain's fight or flight center, called the amygdala, appears to shrink. This primal region of the brain associated with fear and emotion is involved in the initiation of the body's response to stress. As the amygdala shrinks, the prefrontal cortex becomes thicker, and this area is associated with higher order brain functions such as awareness, attention, and concentration. The scale of the changes correlate with the number of hours of meditation practice. Then from Psychology Today in 2015, the article is entitled, "Our Amygdala Influences Kindness and Altruism, Not Just Fear." And a quote from that article says, "Recent cutting-edge neuroscientific research has revealed an unexpected twist. The amygdala is actually involved in a much broader range of emotions beyond fearfulness. As it turns out, The amygdala isn't simply the brain's fear center. In fact, based on research from University of Pennsylvania, Yale University, and Duke University, they found that the amygdala plays an important role in pro-social behaviors such as kindness, altruism, and charitable giving. And I've watched several TED Talks, and one of them has been on our front web page for like a year and a half, where that Cambridge scientist also talks about how meditation increases people's compassion. I mean, Ernest Holmes is doing a dance, or maybe he was the angel sending it down. Because for the monks, for Thich Nhat Hanh, who've known about mindfulness increasing compassion, the Dalai Lama, neuroscience is now proving, as they study the brain, that that mindfulness does increase your compassion and hence transform suffering. And you can just read about all this science, but reading about it won't change your amygdala. Just like reading about exercise will not change your muscle strength or endurance. It's the practice of mindfulness that changes your brain. So here you are at the Center for Spiritual Living, Chico, learning how you are a center for spiritual living. With our classes, our activities, and our connection with one another. As you bring your awareness into how your spiritual practice works to improve your life, I hope that you find inspiration, that you are empowered to practice mindfulness together and apart, to meditate and to transform human suffering by practicing compassion. You are loved, my beloveds. Namaste.